Good. So welcome everyone. We're just waiting for our attendees to file in, so we'll begin momentarily. Hi. Okay, so welcome everybody to our review panel and book launch event, Priestly Narratives, a review panel and book launch for Liane Feldman's Story of Sacrifice. My name is Annette Yoshko-Reed. I am a member of the Skirball Department of Hebrew and Judaic Studies, which is sponsoring this event. Liane Feldman is an assistant professor in our department, and we could not be more delighted to both celebrate and discuss her first book, The Story of Sacrifice, Ritual and Narrative in the Priestly Pentateuchal Source, published by Moore Zebak in 2020. The book is also the winner of the 2021 Manfred Lautenschlager Award for Theological Promise. And today we'll be discussing with four panelists who I'll introduce. Initially, each of them will speak for about 10 minutes, after which Liane, Professor Feldman, will respond, and we'll open up to questions thereafter. I should note that questions will be fielded through the Q&A feature, so you can write them at any time. But keep in mind, we'll hold them for the end, and they'll be addressed in the webinar setting. And I'll remind you of that also at the end. So welcome, thank you for attending. We could be very, I couldn't be more delighted to have be able to celebrate and also discuss the work of my colleague, Professor Feldman, which has been a kind of joy for me to engage during the time that she's been my colleague at NYU. And also, I'm delighted to note that she's expanding it. The interests that she expresses here are both kind of within her book and also expanding outwards into different projects. So it's a special delight also to be able to have, a group of scholars to discuss it with here today, who span a very broad range of biblical studies and Jewish studies and beyond. From Hebrew Bible and ancient Israel, Second Temple Judaism, early Christianity, into Rabbinic Judaism. So our speakers today, and this is the order in which they'll speak as well, are Professor Martha Himmelfarb, who's the William H. Danforth Professor of Religion at Princeton University, Hindi Nyman, who's the Oriel N. Lang Professor of the Interpretation of Holy Scripture at Oriel College at the University of Oxford, Andrew McGowan, who's the Dean and President of Berkeley Divinity School, and McFadden Professor of Anglican Studies and Pastoral Theology at Yale Divinity School, and Mira Ballberg, who's Professor and Endowed Chair in Ancient Jewish Civilization at UC Davis. So with that, I'll turn this over initially to Professor Himmelfarb to begin. Thank you.
Thank you very much. I'm delighted to be here to discuss what's really a wonderful book. So a careful reader of the laws of sacrifice in Leviticus would surely notice that it's not all about priests. First, the non-priestly offerand, just to go to Leviticus 1 and start reading, the non-priestly offerand plays a really active role in the sacrifice. The translations, or at least the English translations I know, often do their best to obscure this, but in fact, it's pretty clear that for the variety of sacrifices in Leviticus 1 through 5, the Israelite who brings the sacrifice actually does the slaughtering at the entrance to the tabernacle. And I think even cuts the sacrifice up into pieces. The priests take over at the point where the altar comes into play, disposing of the blood and burning the animal parts on the altar. So, significant role, slightly horrifying to the modern sensibility, but a very significant role for the non-priest there. And as I say, all you need to do is read the material carefully. I think you would see that. Also, and I think this is something that ancient readers felt more than modern readers do. For modern readers, Leviticus sometimes seems like an overwhelming array of details, telling you more than you ever wanted to know about certain processes. But I think ancient readers noticed that the instructions really don't tell you everything you need to know about sacrifice. There is no clear guidance. To offer one example, about the order in which the pieces of the sacrifice should be placed on the altar. It's possible that the order in which the pieces are mentioned in Leviticus is the correct order, but it's not made explicit there. So, not as clear as possible. Maybe it doesn't matter, although it doesn't seem, the priestly source is generally not the kind of source that, where things are optional. It generally has a very precise way that you're supposed to do things. The second example, there is, the fire on the altar is remarked on. It's of great importance. But what kind of wood burns on the altar, and where does it come from? Both of these questions are questions that were taken up by many texts in the Second Temple period and by the Mishnah. So ancient readers certainly did worry about these things. So really the point I'm trying to make is that P's laws can hardly be understood as a handbook intended to provide a young priest, a starting out priest, with everything he needs to know about how to do his job. Rather, they appear to be, to use our jargon today, more outward facing. A priestly mission statement, if I can use another piece of jargon, directed at the people of Israel as a whole, or at least that's one way of trying to make sense of what's going on there. And I must say, this is sort of how I thought about P and these laws, both on the basis of close reading and of what scholars have said, even before I read Professor Feldman's book, The Story of Sacrifice. But the story of sacrifice really provides a very deep grounding for this picture. And it does so by taking seriously the narrative presentation of Leviticus's laws of sacrifice. By giving careful attention to the narrative, Professor Feldman is able to show how P opens the tabernacle and the world of sacrifice to all Israel in ways that go far beyond what I've just indicated. And here I want to quote from her book. By allowing the reader of the story to share the perspective of its central prophetic character, the story grants the Israelites direct access to the divine commands. That is, the narrative places the reader with Moses. You're standing there with Moses as God reveals the laws of sacrifice, so that the reader knows those laws before Moses has time to repeat them to the Israelites as God has commanded him to. Let me go back to Feldman. Far from being an exclusive instruction manual for the priests, Yahweh's extended speeches invite the reader into the inner circles of the cult and explain its workings to them first, even before Aaron and his sons are ordained as priests. So the reader is there with Moses, and the reader gets this information before Aaron and his sons, the priests. By distinguishing between Israelites as characters in the narrative and Israelites as implied readers, Feldman is able to show us how this process works in the narrative. But it's not just the reader Israelites who have an advantage over the priests. And I'm going to quote Feldman again. Even while the character Israelites are at a disadvantage vis-a-vis the reader Israelites, they are still placed in a position of priority over the priests in the structuring of Yahweh's speeches, with the first lengthier speech in Leviticus 1 through 5 being for the Israelites as a whole, and the second less complete speech in Leviticus 6 through 7 being for Aaron and his sons. It is worth emphasizing that the reader Israelite remains privy to these instructions. In other words, the discourse itself subverts the differentiation between priest and lay Israelite that is being constructed in the story. Now, it seems to me that Feldman's reading of the significance of the narrative presentation of the rules of sacrifice makes a really kind of disciplined and compelling case for peace concern for all Israel. It provides the larger framework for the kind of detail that I mentioned at the beginning, and for that kind of detail, other such details. And let me just quote one more passage from Feldman. What I quoted before comes from page 48, if anybody wants to check, from the middle of the book. But at the end of the book, in her conclusion, she writes, "The very fact of the story's existence and the narrator's choice to allow the reader Israelite to hear and see the internal working of the cult challenges the hegemony of the priesthood and centers the ordinary Israelite in the life of the cult. In many ways, this is a story of the democratization of ideas about religious practice in ancient Israel," which I think is a wonderful, concise statement of a very important and profound contribution. So I think I have a few more minutes. Let me just, I think I want to mention one other thing that I particularly like, and then I want to raise a few questions. One thing I really loved was the interpretation of the story of Nadav and Avihu that Feldman is able to offer on the basis of her reading of the opening chapter of Leviticus 1 through 17. What Aaron's sons did wrong, according to Feldman, is to attempt to gain favor with God for themselves instead of serving in their appointed role as mediators between God and the people of Israel. This, she suggests, is the point of God's words as reported by Moses to Aaron. "I will be sanctified by those near to me," priests are important, "but," and she translates but, not and, "before all of the people, I will be present." The people matter too. Be present is Feldman's very appealing translation of Ekaved. I would have liked to hear a little bit more about justifying that translation of kavod, the glory being present, but I really, I love that reading. So I'm going to conclude with just a few questions. Feldman certainly takes account of the scholarly discussion of the various strata of the priestly source, and some discussion more persuasive than others. But her use of narratology leads her to reject many of the claims of critics who are more inclined to divide up the text. If it makes narrative sense, she's generally prepared to accept the material, or at least to argue that the editor responsible for adding it was so deeply attuned to the narrative that distinguishing between the editor and the authors doesn't really make that much sense. Her final chapter, before the conclusion, certainly has significant implications for our understanding of probably the most widely recognized other strata of the priestly material, the Holiness Code. And she's skeptical about the standard scholarly views of the Holiness Code, though I don't think she elaborates as much as, she had no space to elaborate in the book as it stands. I would have liked to know more, though, about why she is so resistant to what she calls lexical and stylistic criteria, the kind of criteria that Israel Knoll uses. And I have to say, I'm a big fan of Knoll's work on the Holiness Code. And to me, it wasn't obvious that, why there was any conflict between obviously there's some very significant differences of emphasis, but it actually seems to me that his work, Feldman might incorporate his work in ways that would really enrich it and, reflect back some criticism on it, but nonetheless, some very interesting. I don't see a tension between lexical and stylistic criteria and an emphasis on narrative. And I also wonder whether the emphasis on narratology biases one in favor of an author narrator, instead of perhaps editors, collectors. And it seems to me you could imagine a very imaginative collector who was able to do some of the things that Feldman described. So I think I've probably run out of time, and maybe I'll stop there. If we have time in questions, maybe I'll ask something else. But just to end by saying, I think I would have read the book anyway, but I'm not sure I would have been able to read it with as much care as I did for this, because I was invited to participate in this session, and it was just an extremely rewarding experience. Thank you.
Thank you. So thank you, Professor Himmelfarb. And so our next speaker will turn to Professor Hindi Nyman.
Thank you. Thank you to Annette and to Alex for creating this wonderful opportunity to celebrate Liane Feldman's first monograph. I'm delighted to be here, and I also want to join our first panelist, Martha Himmelfarb, in thanking Liane for writing a wonderful and very important book on the priestly narrative. Liane Feldman's The Story of Sacrifice offers new and important correctives to the history of the field of Hebrew Bible and ancient Judaism more broadly. The contributions of this book integrate the voice of the law and ritual into Pentateuchal studies, into the fabric of ancient Judaism, and overall our thinking about creation, anthropology, law and narrative as integrated, and the centrality of the law to any study of Tanakh, Old Testament, and biblical studies more generally. My first section is called Confronting Spät Judentum. Feldman opens her monograph with an odd pair of bedfellows, Julius Wellhausen and Robert Alter. An undiscerning reader might suggest that Feldman is conflating anti-Jewish rejection of the law with post-Enlightenment rejection of the mantic and of the apotropaic. For example, Soren Kierkegaard's discussion of post-Enlightenment rejection of the apostolic on Adler, I think, certainly has something to do with Robert Alter's lack of interest in ritual and law. Actually, Feldman does indeed differentiate the two in ways that run throughout the book. She refuses the Wellhausian humiliation of the law and the uncomprehending post-Enlightenment rejection of sacrifice as efficacious prayer and as the oracular. Feldman achieves this with great nuance and subtlety, and not by engaging with their biases against Judaism or against legalism. Instead, Feldman courageously and consistently confronts scholarly incomprehension and degradation of the law by taking what I want to call the high road. She sustains an entire monograph full of delightful detail of ritual and sacrificial and legal dedication to the call to be holy, Kadoshim Tihiyu, and a deep and nuanced engagement with the narrative of the priestly voice, elevated and celebrated. The story that Liane Feldman tells is one of law narrative, of character and ritual. She never apologizes for the detail, but consistently engages the detail and the broader implications for the universal insights that the priestly narrative can contribute to creation, conceptions of deity, anthropology, and the details of blood, sacrifice, and related rituals. Feldman does not write a book about anti-Semitism or Spät Judentum, but nevertheless, we walk away understanding that there is nothing late about P, but there is also nothing particularly early about P. This is not a book about history. This is not a book about dating. Neither is it, I want to suggest, a book about source criticism, although it presupposes, of course, the priestly source, which she calls the priestly narrative. This is a book that celebrates the ongoing production, engagement, and formation of a narrative which is replete with reciprocal engagements between the deity and the people and the leadership, but which also stands still in time. Just to mention a few pages, the matter of the 8th day of the tabernacle inauguration, page 108 to 111. At the same time, Feldman constructs a heaven on earth, for example, see page 37, where the space for the deity is created. And there are many other discussions of both of these concepts across the book. Feldman has written afresh, a poetic, and inspired literary study of P, what she calls the priestly narrative. This narrative is replete with ritual and also with a suspended sense of time. Time in this narrative barely moves, but the narrative is complex with the intricacies of ritual. Liane Feldman leaves us with priestly narrative, which is elegant and even sublime in its description, as Martha Himmelfarb already invoked the kavod. In a really beautiful way, Feldman helps us appreciate the sophistication and elegance of the priestly narrative, not unlike the way Louth and Herder contributed to their appreciation of biblical poetry as sublime. The narrative of the priestly tradition, says Feldman, is complex and intricate, but always with an eye to the ethereal, the divine, the heavenly, and the primordial. The priestly narrative is about time which organizes the cosmos and the earth, but it can also exemplify an earthly time which stands still in order to create and in order to recreate and regenerate. The priestly narrative, Feldman argues, commemorates ritual. This is a narrativized ritual which creates a world of priestly performance which is textualized. Feldman writes with respect to the ritual components, this is page 5, the priestly narrative does not simply repurpose older materials, but rather the rituals are essential components of the story and its various elements. To separate them, the narrative and the ritual of the priestly narrative is to destroy, says Feldman, the internal structure and the logic of the story. She refuses to read P as derivative, fragmented, and removed from the spirit of the Hebrew Bible, as Wellhausen and others would argue P as being late and legalistic. Her hermeneutics of the priestly narrative as a variegated and complex text with an eye to its own organic unity is something to which I am wholly sympathetic. So my first question for you, Liane, why then is your book not also done with an eye towards the Pentateuch as a whole? Are you willing to think about a larger context to apply the method that you've implemented across the priestly narrative? That is, are you willing to overcome critical rupture, source critical rupture, instead of reading and instead move forward in your reading of the biblical narrative? Okay, a little point about nomos and narrative. Feldman also advances the well-documented discourse of Robert Cover and others on nomos and narrative as interrelated aspects of a single text. Feldman's overarching argument is that nomos and narrative, the law and the ritual, need to be understood, the law and the ritual with a narrative need to be understood as a coherent whole. Thus, according to Feldman, all attempts to undermine the integrity and the centrality of the law, which she calls ritual, are compromised from the start because they're already biased and don't give the priestly narrative a fair hearing. Instead, Feldman refuses to decouple ritual and narrative. Rather, it's her claim that this is a text that focuses on the relationship between ritual instruction and narrative discourse, page 10, and her insistence on including this priestly narrative into the well-established integration, both in legal theory and in ancient Jewish rabbinic texts, I think is incredibly important now for our understanding of how central the biblical and the extra-biblical materials are for the formation of the essential beliefs, practices, and liturgical imagination of Judaism. And here I'm thinking about a whole host of texts, Daniel and Esther, Kohelet, the Dead Sea Scrolls. I'll mention specifically the Hodayot, as well as Wisdom of Solomon, Jubilees, and of course the Temple Scroll. Would you, Liane, then, my next question, would you be willing to extend this claim about nomos and narrative to texts across the Hebrew Bible? Deuteronomy I have in mind, Daniel I have in mind, and Ezra and Nehemiah. Next, scripturalized prayer and ritualized narrative. I want to suggest that Feldman's argument about textualized ritual resonates elegantly with scripturalized prayer, advocated most explicitly by Judith Newman, but also The Place of the Song and Narrative by Steve Weitzman, and both of them drawing upon the work of James Kugel prior to their monographs on the subject. You write on page 12, the act of writing about ritual creates a new context for its interpretation and thus potentially changes the symbolism itself. I want to say that your book contributes to a larger framework for ritual, prayer, and sacrifice that is scripturalized and textualized. Would then you be willing to speak about scriptural prayer alongside textualized ritual? With that, I'm going to move to my next point, creation and imitatio Dei. Feldman argues that the priestly narrative is fundamentally about the creation of the world. The book seeks, says Feldman, to understand the priestly ritual as, quote, world building, unquote, or as part of the creation of the world. In a lovely phrase, she writes, legal discourse is world building discourse, which I think is true for the priestly narrative. We could easily also invoke Philo of Alexandria for that matter. The three creation stories, Genesis 1, Genesis 9, and Leviticus 16 and 17, as well as other chapters that Feldman engages in Leviticus with creation discourse. These three creation stories, Feldman argues in a profound way, create the framework for exile, destruction, restoration, and divine presence again and again on earth. Here, I want to suggest that the themes that Liane Feldman expresses are exemplified across the priestly narrative, but also continue to resurface in many texts: the Hodayot with respect to Imitatio Dei, Wisdom of Solomon with respect to creation, Jubilees on nomos and narrative, Daniel and 4Q instruction on the Raz and the Raz Nihiyah. The potential for poesis, creation, both physical and literary, is instantiated and disseminated through P. P is thus our paradigm, our tavnit. But it also brings heaven and earth together through ritual, which is efficacious and transformative for the human being. This priestly discourse, which by the time of the Hellenistic period is integrated into a legal discourse more broadly, will be essential for understanding Imitatio Dei in the Hodayot, as well as in Jubilees and other related literature. Feldman's approach to P is illuminating for the study of the scrolls, and I believe that the scrolls can reciprocally illuminate the priestly narrative. And again, not because it's late or because P is early, but because there's an ongoing growth and development of these traditions. I found tremendous resonances with Feldman's book for the growth and vitality of Judaism and of scripture, which is already and always across the Hebrew Bible, but especially in P. My question then, might you be willing to think about the ongoing editing of the priestly narrative through redaction, refinement, editing, and new context across the biblical, broadly conceived? How might that dovetail with new findings of reworked Pentateuch like 4Q11 and pluriformity in reworked Pentateuch texts? The priestly narrative creates a dynamic story which continues to be told and retold. And that is the process of storytelling, says Feldman on page 40, that is performed again and again throughout her own book. So now just a few concluding remarks. I want to end then by integrating some of my thoughts and celebration of a book which teaches us how to love the priestly narrative. Feldman's reading shows the whole and the parts. It's a remarkable corrective that Liane Feldman offers across this monograph, which is a game changer for biblical studies. The priestly narrative is a coherent and integrating work, which is formative for ancient Judaism. Feldman shows again and again that the legalistic and ritual details of P belong as early and as an integrated part of the priestly narrative and cannot be decoupled from the larger theological discourses that were privileged as early in Protestant biblical scholarship. The centrality of creation, which is crystallized not in one, but three creation narratives through creation, destruction, and rebuilding, is exemplified in this book through the universal and the particular, as exemplified through the priestly narrative. The ongoing shaping, editing, and transmission of the priestly narrative comes to be part of the vital and vibrant narrative that is emerging from the Second Temple period and beyond. Liane Feldman's corrective is philologically rigorous, poetic, and conceptually rich for the understanding of the concepts connected to God, to ritual, and especially to holiness. And here I have in mind a lovely section from page 141 and following. What is at stake is what comes to be known as Sefer Torah Moshe, Nomos Museos, the Law of Moses, and the Nachleben of this tradition across the history of Judaism. We thank you, Liane, for a wonderful book and for teaching us so much.
Thank you. Thank you, Professor Nyman. So our next speaker is Professor Andrew McGowan.
Thank you, Professor Reed, for this invitation, and thank you, Professor Feldman, for this book. It's wonderful to sit with such an august group, among whom I feel something of a pretender as someone who works on early Christianity. And rather than thinking, though, about the reception of these questions in early Christianity, I'm coming to this book as someone who is very much interested in the diachronic question of the invention and reinvention of sacrifice in ancient texts of a variety of kinds. So I'm reading the story of sacrifice as I read Exodus and Leviticus very much as an amateur who wants to connect these things with longer stories, and I'm enormously grateful. I think this is a very important study that achieves a number of goals, some of which have already been noted. The work contributes, and I think Professor Nyman has stated this beautifully, it contributes to one of the most persistent hermeneutical problems in dealing with the Pentateuch's ritual texts, wherein interpreters are tempted to excise or marginalize or downplay the elements which do not suit them so well in a variety of ways, but which all end up similarly, at least in their reductionism. And so with a really deft touch and a significant kind of methodological sophistication, Dr. Feldman brings these texts back, as it were, treating them above all as part of the priestly narrative on something closer to what really seems to be their own terms. So she also joins others in warning against reading them, however, directly as evidence for practice. If this is about sacrifice, it's about an idea of sacrifice as much or more than it is about anything that you should do with knives, animals, fires, and rocks. But in doing this, she adds some intriguing suggestions about how we might read these texts in relation to sacrifice and as a practice. And I'll say some more about that. I also just wanted to say how struck I am by the fact that she combines tools that scholars have so often seemed to be forced to choose between, working on the one hand with the traditional rigor of source criticism, and on the other hand with the narratological and literary possibilities. Bringing these both together, I think, is a great achievement in itself. In my remarks that remain, I want to concentrate really on the second chapter of the book, which is what Professor Feldman calls Moses' private audience at the end of Exodus and the beginning of Leviticus, which, in focusing on a quite specific part of the text, nevertheless opens up this huge question of sacrifice itself, I think. And my remarks amount, I hope, to an appreciative conversation where I'm acknowledging how Professor Feldman's work is prompting me to ask some new questions. With the subheading, Some Assembly Required, which some readers will remember earlier in the second chapter, she humorously sort of pointed my mind in a particular experiential path. Now, like many of you, I have had to rearrange physical working space during the pandemic to place accoutrements in a new kind of order, reflecting my own sort of personal cosmology, as it were. And for the first time, in fact, in 7 years living in the particular home where I have, I've actually inhabited what is supposed to be my home office for the first time. Does this sound familiar to some who are listening today? A place where I'd simply dumped books before has now become the place where I sort of live in the day and work. And I know that I'm not alone in having resorted to the sacred tools and wisdom of IKEA in finding a way in which to create this space and bring it into existence. So I've had my own mosaic moments, as it were, where I found myself very much like the Moses of that later part of Exodus 40, in a passage that Professor Feldman expounds beautifully, putting things together by myself, whether or not adhering to the common sense that one would suggest should be exercised when one is trying to put together large and potentially dangerous pieces of furniture. In fact, I confess that I've sat myself today here specifically in front of the 3 IKEA bookcases, which made their presence in my life during the course of the past year. Whether or not guided by common sense, then at least guided by the authoritative instruction of the accompanying texts, those ones they give you, which have no words, but a variety of helpful infographics, which are supposed to guide you not only to success in arranging the space, but also to success in not causing yourself any serious harm, which is always a good thing. Now, Professor Feldman draws our attention to the remarkable nature of Moses' performances, which seem not only, as it were, to have Moses going to IKEA and ignoring the infographic showing the need for helpers, but also apparently skipping a page in the instructions. You know how disastrous that is when you skip a page and do the wrong thing in the right order. And what I mean by that is, of course, that she points to how he starts using the tent and its equipment in the course of actually assembling it in this really interesting passage at the end of Exodus 40, and in particular that he makes a burnt offering and a grain offering at a point where, at least according to some logics, what's he doing? Why is this happening now? So my questions really from here on are, why now, Moses, and why these 2 offerings in particular? I don't think that we can just lightly assimilate these in particular to some general idea of sacrifice, quote unquote, which even, of course, as Professor Feldman reminds us, doesn't really exist in the priestly writings narrative world yet at this point. Hence, I don't think it's quite enough to say that Moses performs sacrifices a little bit ahead of time, because sacrifice itself, if I read the priestly writing correctly, and largely, I think, following Professor Feldman, if sacrifice hasn't yet actually been brought into being, if we read a little beyond the priestly writing, I'm perhaps picking up a hint that Professor Nyman offered as well. If we read the Pentateuchal narrative as a whole, there've actually, of course, been numerous specific offerings made prior to this, but presumably not in the priestly writing as it's usually being reconstructed. But also in particular, there's been nothing that anyone called Qurban. And in priestly terms, Moses may be doing something remarkable in Exodus 40, but arguably he's still not sacrificing if we take the narratological hints that I think Professor Feldman offers us seriously, because sacrifice itself does not yet exist until Leviticus 1 offers this overarching category of Qurban as a way to think in a single way about what have previously been unrelated offering practices. In trying to explain Moses' curious action, Dr. Feldman emphasizes the unusual use of the Hifil forms of the word Allah for Moses' offerings instead of what she calls the more commonly used Karav language, Allah language about elevating something and bringing it up. And in the story of sacrifice, she points convincingly to how in the narrative that seems to fit well with the idea that Moses is trying to attract the divinity, to draw God's presence down so it will inhabit the tent at that point. But I think there may be an additional narratological point to be made here, for which I'll credit her, namely that the Allah language is also the language used for two crucial non-priestly Pentateuchal offerings prior to this point, if we read a bit beyond the priestly narrative. That's to say, Noah also elevates his post-diluvian offerings. He uses the same kind of language. And Abraham likewise elevates the substitutionary ram who is offered instead of Isaac. And these are two of the most sort of foundational stories of sacrifice in the overall Pentateuchal narrative, even if they're not part of the priestly thing. So I know I'm going off the rails here a little bit in terms of how the priestly part works, but I think it's interesting that Moses does something that makes perfect sense in the canonical Pentateuchal narrative as a whole by using this kind of language here, and not simply relative to what the priestly writing doesn't want to reveal at this point. I think it's also important to say that while Professor Feldman sort of suggests that the Karav language is more commonly used for this kind of activity than the Elevate Allah language, then in fact, I think it's only at this point in Leviticus 1 that the Karav language really becomes cultic. And so the question of commonality is not the only question that has to be asked. I think, again, taking Professor Feldman's narratological finesse seriously, it's actually important here, not simply that Moses is doing something exceptional, but Moses is doing something which is narratologically appropriate relative to what has and has not yet become the case as far as the priestly narrative is concerned, as well as far as the overall Pentateuchal narrative would be concerned. So why now Moses was my first question, but why these two? And this one I'm still struggling with, I must admit, so I'm really hoping that Professor Feldman or others may have wisdom about this, because Moses, as I said, doesn't perform sacrifices. I don't think sacrifice exists until we get to Leviticus 1 and have this notion of Qurban offered to tell us that there's a master category called sacrifice. He instead performs these two particular offerings called an olah and a mincha. So the burnt offering in particular is probably not hard to explain from a variety of perspectives. It's the ideal offering, the definitive offering, whatever people have made of it by seeing it lead off the series of Levitical offerings in the next chapter. And it requires no other participant. So it's actually an easy one to construct on your own, like another IKEA piece that doesn't require the second person in the infographic. But the grain offering really puzzles me. There's no one else there to benefit. And the grain offering usually has the capacity to sort of be something which is understood as part of the priestly provision. Now, there's the connection, of course, that we're about to see in Leviticus 2, which provides that as perhaps the second most important offering. What's going on there? That's another story. So perhaps in this priestly scheme, the grain offering has a greater prominence as a fundamental offering in this structure than we might infer if we were reading other biblical texts putting offerings side by side, where we're more likely to see a sort of hendiadys that puts olah and zabach next to each other as being a sort of pairing that sort of sum up offering practices generally. And I think this could undergird that acute narratological analysis that Professor Himmelfarb already mentioned with regard to how the priestly writing draws the Israelites themselves into the picture. This is, I think, another great contribution of this book, the way that this is laid out with such interest and clarity. And what I mean by this is that perhaps it's because of the significance of the mincha to the ritual work of the ordinary Israelite that the grain offering becomes the other thing that's done to actually inaugurate the presence of the tent. And if I'm not right about that guess, then I guess the question that I remain with is, well, why not the other offerings? What else is not done at that point, and why are these two the ones that that address the putting into motion, the putting into action, the creation of the ritual work of the tent in Moses' private audience. Professor Feldman then goes on to present Leviticus 1 to 7 properly and unsurprisingly as the introduction of sacrifice. Now, I've already suggested that if it's one thing for us to say that this might be the first time that cultic offerings appear at all in the priestly narrative, and I'm not sufficiently expert to want to challenge that judgment. But I find it interesting that there's a measure of redundancy in the labored introduction of this notion of Qurban as a master category here. So it's not simply, in other words, that we've started talking about offerings. In particular, we've started talking about offerings as being species that belong to a genus. And this genus is Qurban, which seems to have some kind of significance for the priestly narrative and priestly sensibilities generally, which it doesn't seem to have in other biblical sources. In fact, we look in vain to find people talking about these other offerings as Qurbanot outside this sort of priestly setting, outside the priestly narrative or Ezekiel. And of course, it may be exactly that is what's going on here, that there is a sort of deliberate redundancy, not only about introducing the offerings as such individually, but also introducing them necessarily as species that belong to this genus. But my question would be, what exactly is the purpose of that literary contrivance, this narratological contrivance here? Professor Feldman says that, quote, the concept of sacrifice is systematically introduced. And I think it's important again to add, and I'm thinking of Professor Nyman's comments here, it's interesting at least to add that strictly speaking, this is true not only of the priestly narrative, but of the whole Pentateuch. Because while there are plenty of other offerings that take place prior to this in the Pentateuchal narrative as a whole, they're called by these various species names prior to this point. It's only at this point that there is any one concept that actually describes them together that appears. And I think that we have to struggle with the fact, and we do struggle with the fact, that we as readers construct a kind of horizon that performs a sort of commonality onto these different offerings and calls them sacrifices, when in fact there are no lexical connections between these different activities whatsoever, until this category of Qurban is offered as a way of trying to understand them relative to a whole conceptually, and of course relative to a particular space. And the priestly narrative does this. So this could indeed be called, as Professor Feldman calls it, a broad idea of sacrifice, unquote. But it's a very specific idea of sacrifice, and it doesn't seem to be an idea of sacrifice that's shared in other biblical texts and traditions. So I think it's somewhat important to emphasize how focused an idea it is. In fact, I wouldn't say necessarily that it's a broad idea of sacrifice, but a narrow idea of sacrifice, a very specific and focused one. And arguably, in any case, a conceptual claim with genuine originality, or at least distinctiveness relative to those implied Israelite readers, who must know, of course, perfectly well that there are things that they perform that are called things like Zabah and Minha and so on, but I wonder whether they know quite as clearly that the things that they perform are also called Qurban. So in IKEA terms, as it were, for the priestly narrative, it's not just that one buys a bookcase, as if the idea of a bookcase is somehow readily available to the purchaser before going in. You buy a billy or a hemnes or whatever it is, and then you have to work out whether or not this relates to the category of other billy products, or whether it relates to the quality of bookcase, as that extends into other things with different names. And you gather I speak here from experience, both sweet and bitter. Anyway. So it's not just that we're being introduced to offerings, but to a category that gathers and interprets offerings. So yes, we are being introduced to sacrifice. And I think this is so important. Professor Feldman has done this so well. But that isn't just a claim about the narratology. It isn't just a claim about the chronology at the point at which it's appropriate to start using any kind of description of offerings, but rather the point at which it's possible to talk about these mutually interpretive offerings and the sacred space to which they belong, and the cult which gives them their authority. Finally, I've already noted, as indeed Professor Himmelfarb in particular did, the significance of how Dr. Feldman's narratological work highlights the Israelites themselves. I think this is such an interesting subset of that issue that Professor Nyman referred to, about the way in which the priestly narrative has so often been interpreted in a kind of jaundiced way. because, of course, in various anti-Semitic and in anti-clerical and anti-Catholic readings, the priest becomes the trope of the villain in these kinds of narratives. And if we can simply drop out all this material ritual dross, we will have the pure narrative of history sort of left to us, and we know where that goes. Now, I think this is a stunning insight, and one that I'm still pondering, but I also have a measure of suspicion or qualification that I want to add to it just for consideration. I do think that this helps make sense of why on earth a work like this is written and who it's for. But I find myself wondering about identifying it primarily as a participatory or even democratizing move, at least solely. So I don't want to sound completely reductionist about this. But I find myself wondering, not least in the light of recent political experiences in the contemporary world, whether this kind of narrative could be understood to be populist as much as democratic, where those two things are not, of course, quite the same in terms of how they're harnessing the power of popular performance and popular activity. The authors of this text clearly see a very significant role for suppliants, but that could, of course, mean cementing their place in the economy of offering, turning them into loyal customers who will keep coming back, making their offerings, and yes, reading the authoritative instructions very carefully, just as Moses does. So again, I join my colleagues in congratulating Dr. Feldman on this very fine work, and I look forward both to the further impact of this book on the field, but also to its ramifications for broader conversations about sacrifices and offerings. Thank you.
Thank you very much. And now we turn to our final panelist, and I'd like to correct an embarrassing mistake that I made in terms of her affiliation. So our final panelist is Mira Balberg, who's professor and endowed chair in ancient Jewish civilizations at UC San Diego. And apologies for my misspeaking in that regard. So thank you.
All the UCs are allies. This is fine. Well, thank you, Annette, and thank you for inviting me. Thank you for allowing me to participate in this panel. Thank you for everyone who stayed to this point. Inevitably, since I'm the last speaker, I will repeat some of the praise of the previous speakers. Please see it as a further endorsement of this wonderful book. It has been a pleasure to witness the inception and development of this book from an early stage. I had that privilege. The project in this book is very close to my heart, for two reasons. First of all, it is moved by the love of systems, by the quest for order and coherence in what can seem like an array of technical details. It features the joy of recreating a world for what may seem like dry, boring materials. But second, and more important, it makes the forceful claim that seemingly boring technical details are a powerful literary tool through which cultural agents tell a particular story that is central to their understanding of the world. The book powerfully makes a claim, to which I am likewise very committed in my own work, that when set in a particular context, instructions, procedures, and lists, I will return to lists later, can be read not only as impressive literary accomplishments, but also as mines for intellectual history. This claim is audacious and even a defiant one, since, as Feldman discusses in the introduction, most scholars prefer to read the instructional technical materials in the priestly code as insertions of self-standing manuals that are not part of the greater plot. And the previous speakers have alluded to some of the historical reasons for that tendency. The common perception is that some priestly technocrat picked up some cookbook-like texts that were on the shelf in the temple and copied and pasted them into the otherwise compelling story of creation, ancestry, liberation, journey, and settlement. Feldman commences with the overview, with the interview with Robert Alter that was mentioned, in which he confesses to his dislike of sacrificial instructions because he finds them unappealing, non-aesthetic, non-literary in the traditional sense. And yes, he's also says that he's not a vegetarian, but does not particularly like meat or something like that. This is the view that is rejected in this book, in which Feldman beautifully demonstrates that the ritual instructions and their performance in Leviticus and in part of Numbers are in fact an integral part of the narrative and are construed with utmost care for detail. These ostensibly non-narrative materials in Leviticus are actually playing a crucial part in the narrative, and they are carefully designed to give the greater narrative depth and meaning. To make this point, Feldman offers a detail-oriented approach for the correspondence between space, place, characters, readers, and narrator in the text, and makes a highly convincing case that the non-narrative parts are in fact narrative. They are not interruptions in the flow of the story, but rather they are the story. Furthermore, and I think this is my favorite thing about the book shows that what is often read as repetitive is in fact one-timely. While the literary forms of the instructions lend themselves to do this thing over and over again, the moment in which the instructions are given in the story is a unique moment that only happened once. So the giving of instruction is an event that is very dramatic as such. And this moment as such is charged with a drama of its own. When read through the lens of one-timeliness, the speaking events in the story are filled with new significance and, I dare say, beauty. What makes the common move of dismissing the cultic instructions and eliminating them from the narrative sequence possible, as so many scholars who said this was just, copied from some manual have said, is the fact that those instructions are not given a clear rationale or explanation. On the face of it, the priestly code does not make a point of saying why. It only says how. Since the how is not eminently meaningful, it is easy to dismiss it as nothing more than priestly busywork, a set of procedures that are purposefully construed as complicated and elaborated so that the priest can assert their expertise. What Feldman shows beautifully in the book is that the how, when read carefully and in a narrative context, entails the why. It just does so through the details and not on top of the details. The preference of how to why as the main mode of discourse is what makes the priestly code so relevant to my own work, which focuses primarily on the Mishnah. In general, the Mishnah and the priestly code have a lot in common, not only because the priestly code is the largest law code in the Bible and thus serves as the infrastructure to much of the Mishnah's edifice, but also because they share the same modus operandi of what we may call legal/ritual fantasy. Imagining a normative world, not necessarily as it exists now, but as it should exist, and paying closest attention to the most minute details of which the fantasy is made in order to make it real. Both the priestly code and the Mishnah, although many people will probably not think of them at all in these terms, are works of imagination. They are works that create worlds from numerous technical details. And those are not worlds that exist as such, but works that express certain religious and social visions, woven from a mixture of real and ideal. And in both the priestly code and in the Mishnah, the key word is process, or better yet, procedure. Human action in the world is proceduralized, broken down into small segments and then recombined in different configurations. And this proceduralization is both the medium and the message. While the Mishnah, unlike the priestly code, is not a story and cannot be construed as a narrative, I found that many of Professor Feldman's greater insight on the reading of ritual instructions and ritual performances applies beautifully to the Mishnah as well. One of my major takeaways from the book is that the giving of instructions is an event. When an individual named sage or anonymous sages in the Mishnah speak, an external narrator is the one who reports, Rabbi Yeshua said this, or when Rabbi Akiva was in the market, he said that. And thereby the narrator creates a world in which the speak acts of the sages are events that in this case sort of generate what we could call a rabbinic movement. And I think this is one of the most important things that the field of rabbinics needs to understand. The concept of rabbinic movement is something that is generated by a text that is narrated by someone or some people. Greater attention to the narrated nature of instructions and ruling in the Mishnah allows us to be more sensitive for the constructed nature of the text as a medium through which a certain ethos of Jewish observance is created. And this is something that this book allowed me to see. In the time I have remaining, I wish to point to one particular technical genre that Feldman engages with beautifully in the book, which I find particularly pertinent to the Mishnah and perhaps to other texts as well. And this subgenre is lists. The priestly code is notorious for its affection to lists, whether they take the form of genealogy, itinerary, inventory, or geographical survey. The material Feldman analyzes in the book includes quite a few lists, which she brings to life in fantastic ways. This most dry literary form, which seems like mere enumerations of items, one after the other, is shown time and again to be meaningful, both in form and in content. The list of forbidden and permitted animals in Leviticus 11, for example, is an event of categorization, which is significant as a marker of transformation in the world, as Professor Feldman explains. The very fact that new categories of animals are created and populated marks a new stage in the relations between God, humanity, and the world. It's not just the content of the bins that Leviticus 11 creates, like pure, impure, abominable, and so on, but the very notion that such bins exist. My personal favorite example, to which I admittedly never paid attention before reading the book, is the list of gifts given by the prince of each of the tribes in Numbers chapter 7. This list is so repetitive that it just always skipped it. Like, I actually never read the list. I was just like, all right, let's move on. But Feldman's analysis revealed that this list communicates two very important messages that are indeed crucial to the story world. First, and this relates to things that were mentioned earlier, the bringing of the gifts itself, which is communicated through this list, is a critical part of the inauguration of the tent of meeting, as Feldman completely convincingly argues. The list creates a dynamic picture of involvement of the people of Israel as a whole in the inauguration of the tent of meeting, thereby revealing the purpose of the sanctuary vis-a-vis the community in its entirety and not only the priests, this democratization that was mentioned. It is said to correspond with the scene in Exodus 31, in which the people of Israel willingly contribute their personal possessions for the making of the tent of meeting. Second, the fact that each one of the tribes brings exactly the same gifts, despite the tribe's different sizes, pushes forth an idealized image of egalitarianism and harmony within the community. This list and other like it speak, and if listened to, they reveal a well-crafted theological and social vision. Robert Belknap distinguished between utilitarian lists on the one hand, which, quote, fulfill a reference function, acting as a resource in which information is ordered so it can be swiftly and easily located, and literary lists, on the other hand, which, quote, convey a specific impression. Their role is the creation of meaning rather than merely the storage of it, end quote. Undoubtedly, most people would classify the priestly list, and likewise Mishnaic lists, of which there are many, as utilitarian, and thus will not suppose that such lists mean anything. I would argue, however, that Mishnaic lists, particularly very long and elaborate ones, have a very urgent message to communicate. And this is something that I am taking from this book to my own work. The impression that Mishnaic lists seek to convey to their readers or listeners is that the rabbinic system of knowledge, or halakha, encompasses and governs everything and anything that exists. As I argued elsewhere, Mishnaic lists are essentially receptacles of our abstract rabbinic principles filled with real world items, thus establishing halakha as a totalizing way, and indeed as the ultimate way of seeing, organizing, and understanding the entire world. In addition, I think like the lists in P, lists in the Mishnah tell us a story about the world, about family, about nature, about community boundaries, and so on. So one of the things I'm really curious to hear from Liane is her further thoughts about lists as a literary genre in P and perhaps beyond it. And finally, I want to conclude with one question out of sheer curiosity. If the story of the construction and inauguration of the tent of meeting is indeed so firmly set in the greater narrative context of P, and I'm convinced that it is, one issue remains inexplicable to me. Isn't it odd that all these expensive materials, wood and gold and incense and frankincense, and all those dozens and dozens of sacrificial animals were collected while the Israelites were in the wilderness? Does this not in some way suggest a certain detachment of the narrative from the greater context of the wilderness itinerary in which it is situated? Is it supposed to be some kind of suspension of disbelief? So that's something that I want to hear your thoughts about. And I will conclude here, and I'm very, very eager to finally hear Liane. Thank you.
So thank you very much, and thanks to the panelists for actually we covered quite a bit of ground here, and so turning this to Professor Feldman's response or reactions.
Sure. So I don't think in 10, 15 minutes there's any way I'm going to get to all of these questions, but I feel like we're going to have a conversation, and so we might get there anyway. But first, I just wanted to say thank you so much to all of you. I'm so honored that you took the time to engage this book so deeply and so thoughtfully, and I have learned a ton just from listening to you and listening to sort of your reflections and how this fits with your work. So I'm really excited to sort of think with you about these questions, to have heard what you were talking about, and to bring some of that actually into some of my next projects, because you have raised things that I hadn't necessarily realized that came through in the book in that way. So it's always funny to see what a reader sees that the author doesn't necessarily know she's doing. So that's always a fun moment. So yeah, I think I'm just going to start with that question that Mira just posed, because that is one, I mean, it's I guess the hardest and the easiest one for me to answer, because I don't know. I have no idea where they get all of this stuff. That is a moment, it's one of those things that, early interpreters, or some earlier source critical interpreters would have argued that one throwaway line early on in Exodus, when the Israelites take all of the jewelry from the Egyptians, that's got to belong to P. Otherwise, where did they get all that stuff? It doesn't. It's not part of the story, so I don't think that's the answer. I think, there are a lot of parts of P, not just that involve a suspension of disbelief. That you sort of have to imagine that the creation of this opulent, very over-the-top tabernacle with gold and fine woven curtains and gold-plated this and silver-plated that, and with hundreds and hundreds of pieces, is something that can be broken down, moved around the wilderness. Pieces don't get lost. Pieces somehow, things somehow stay in perfect shape despite the environment of what we know of the wilderness, right? That is not exactly the most hospitable of places. So I think it's not just the suspension of disbelief in this story is not just where do they get these materials, but how do they even sustain this in the wilderness for 40 years? And part of that is, well, when they make it, they're not planning on sustaining it for 40 years. That 40-year delay in the wilderness comes later. It's sort of something that is not part of the plan, and then the plan goes awry. But still, it's one of those things that I think the priestly narrative as a whole does require some level of suspension of disbelief. And some of that is the fun of creating an idealized environment. So I just say, yeah, that it's the easiest and the hardest, because I don't have a great answer for that one. But I did want to, I think there's a couple of questions that I was making notes, and they seem to go reasonably well together. So I think one that I wanted to talk about, and I think it sort of ties something that Hindi asked with something that Andrew was asking. So Hindi, you asked me, why not just do this with the whole Pentateuch? Why stick to just P? And Andrew, in a comment that you made, well, this use of Allah as a sacrificial term is very, poignant and very noticeable in the Noah story, in both the non-priestly Noah story and the non-priestly Akedah story in Genesis 22. And so that, as you were building that out, I'm like, yeah, I see how what Hindi's saying there could be, that kind of hermeneutic could be applied to the Pentateuch as a whole. So why am I not doing that? So I think I'm going to say, I think it can be done, because, so that's my first statement there, is I think it can be done. And I think in some ways it has to be done, because at some point, the Pentateuch as a whole is a meaningful document and a meaningful story for a particular community, and that we should be trying to understand what that story is, what world it's building, what sort of, in Mira's wonderful terms, what procedures, what proceduralizations it's, what lists, how it's thinking through that. But that's not my project here, and I'm not sure that that's the project that I would necessarily want to do, in part because I think what I'm trying to get at with P is that it is world building, and that the world it builds is very distinct, and it has very specific features to it that become kind of diluted or lost if we read it in the frame of the broader Pentateuch. It's a different world entirely if you're reading in the broader frame of the Pentateuch, or if you're reading in the broader frame of the Hebrew Bible. There are other elements that are sort of incorporated in the building of that world. And that has been, I think, part of my resistance to do that, and to just allow the world of the priestly text to stand on its own, is because there is such a tradition of apologizing for the idiosyncrasies, for the oddness, for the unfamiliarity, for the seeming boringness of the world of the priestly text, that, you know, as I think all of you said in one way, I don't want to apologize for it, because I don't think it's boring. I don't think, you know, it's very rich and it's very full. And so I think part of why in this process I am sort of pushing to keep the priestly world separate from applying the hermeneutic to the Pentateuch as a whole, is to allow the strangeness of that world, to allow sort of the unfamiliarity of that world to stand and to sort of be analyzed on its own terms, rather than conflating it with other worlds that are being built in other texts. Not to say it can't be done, just that I'm sort of in this project choosing not to. And that sort of ties to something, Hindi, that you were saying, when you say, would you extend this kind of nomos and narrative approach to texts outside of P, across the Hebrew Bible or across early Jewish literature? And the answer is yes. You know that, though, because that, like, the method that I was developing and trying out here, this narratological approach to ritual and legal texts, is something that I think does work for other texts in the Hebrew Bible and in early Jewish literature. It's something that I've already sort of taken and used on the Aramaic Levi document in an article that I just did a few months ago. It's sort of the cornerstone of the approach that I'm taking in my next book, looking at sacrificial texts in Second Temple Judaism. So I think that, and that is looking at things like Chronicles and Jubilees and Temple Scroll and Aramaic Levi and Letter of Aristeas, and saying, like, what are the sacrificial worlds that are being built via the story and via the ritual representations within those stories. So I think taking seriously that nomos and narrative absolutely should be extended across biblical and early Jewish literature as a whole. So, okay, sorry, looking back at my notes. Oh yes, I'll go back to, also looking at my time, so it looks like I have about 5 minutes. So I will go back to a question that Martha raised, because I'm surprised, Mira, that you didn't raise this question also, because Mira, of course, saw this in its dissertation form, which was relatively different than the final book form. And I think part of that, actually, Martha, and one of the questions you raised is something that I did in the dissertation that I didn't do in the book. And when you talked about narratology and Leviticus 17 and saying, okay, that is, and I fully understand, you know, that chapter on Leviticus 17 is sort of the most provocative, I guess, of all of the chapters in the book. It has sort of the most out there of arguments trying to say maybe we shouldn't talk about at least Leviticus 17 as part of the Holiness Code. And I sort of end on a conclusion, like, maybe we should reconsider the concept of the Holiness Code as an entity. And some of that is, as you were correctly noting, that I sort of wanted to devalue a little bit the lexical and stylistic criteria that are raised in things like Knoll. And I think you're right to push back on that. I toned down my, from the dissertation to the book, I toned down my sort of critique of that some. It's still there. I think what I'll say about, so one thing I will say is there was an entire chapter in the dissertation that then went on to Leviticus 18 through 26 and sort of did a preliminary approach to what in here looks like it's continuous with the narrative, what doesn't, how, like, what are the criteria for determining that? What does it mean to use lexical and stylistic criteria versus looking at particular lexemes that have ideological or theological meaning in specific contexts? And so I took that chapter out of the book. I decided that, you know, in the end, I wanted this book to be about reading P and not about reading or not about making an argument about P versus the holiness code, that I really just didn't want both of those things in here. So I took that part out. Someday maybe it'll be an article. Maybe I'll sort of get that together to turn it into an article. But I think sort of your pushback here is correct, because some of what I talked about in that chapter is that there are notable lexical and stylistic differences in some of, especially in 18 through 26. But I think what I'm pushing back against is the idea of making word lists. Like the part of Knoll's book I don't like is here's a list of P words and here's a list of H words, and then we can determine what strata or what stratum it belongs to based on if these words appear. And if that sort of ends up in Knoll's book as a very disjointed final text that like P is nothing, everything is H by the end. Or everything that has meaning making possibility is in H. And I'm not entirely convinced by what that offers. And so I was in that chapter, and as I'm thinking about this going forward, thinking about the possibility of how do we use, for example, the idea that Kodesh, that's like the main one, right? Holiness. That when it shows up in something like Leviticus 21 or 22, Knoll's like, oh, it shows up, I don't know, 9, 10, 12 times in these chapters. So clearly the overarching idea here is holiness. And so this is probably part of the holiness stratum. And part of what I was pushing back in that chapter that's not in the book is saying the holiness in that chapter is very different. The concept of holiness in chapters 21 and 22 is very, very different than the concept of holiness in chapter 19, Kedoshim Tihu. Like that's the holiness of the people. That's the sort of the ability of the people to perform holiness, the obligation of the people to become holy. Whereas the holiness in chapters 21 and 22 is really about the inherent ritual transformation of the priests from ordinary to holy. And that's a different process. And so some of my pushback on the lexical and stylistic is to say we actually have to think about it a little bit more contextually. And who is it, like which characters is it talking about? How's it being used? And in the end, I think perhaps reducing Leviticus 17 through 27 or 17 through 26 to just H, to just the holiness code, might be too easy. Like there may actually be more redactional hands, more editorial layers in there than just the one. And so you can see why I didn't totally want to go here in the book, because it just goes off in a whole other direction. So I just want to say it was there in the dissertation, and then I sort of decided this isn't what I wanted to do in the book. But I absolutely hear that and sort of appreciate that pushback, because I can see where it comes without that part there in the book. It can sort of come across as a little bit more harshly against that mode than I would hopefully try to nuance it if that chapter were there. But I realize I'm at 15 minutes and I haven't answered them all, but I will stop here for now.
Thank you very much. It's true. We had a very sweeping kind of questions. Although one of the things I will say is as somebody who also loves reading about sacrifice and loves lists and loves details and loves proceduralism, it's actually very nice to be able to just, both have your book as a real expression of that. And also this conversation about your book also is a real expression of that, of a way in which, that recovering as well as really thinking about the way in which these details made meaning, where when we don't skip over them, when we don't cut them out or bracket them or so forth. So by means of questions, so please, for audience members, please write questions in the Q&A. And we'll address them in a moment, and already have actually some great questions there. But initially, I want to be able to turn to the panelists to see if anyone had comments. And Professor Nyman had noted that she does.
So thank you. I just 3 brief things. The second 2 I think are connected. But the first thing I wanted to say is that my question for you was more of an invitation with respect to applying what I consider to be a method, and very much standing on the shoulders of giants, as you do in chapter 5. And I just pulled out some of the passages where you talk about hermeneutics and text composition. And this is what I meant when I said it's not a book about source criticism, right? So, and I think what you're doing is getting a lot of fresh air into Pentateuchal research and scholarship, which is so essential. You can't take one step forward in the study of ancient Judaism, whether it's biblical or extra biblical or rabbinic, without thinking about Pentateuch. And I think in that respect, that's what I was moving towards. And I don't think that in any way this book fell short of not engaging the Hodayot or the Temple Scroll, or not engaging D, right? And what you want to do with non-P materials is a different conversation. So that's part of it. But building on that, I do think that your response, if I can be a little bit provocative to Martha, is a bit stronger than what you said, because there is an extensive discussion where you engage Bloom in chapter 5, where you say, actually, you accept Bloom's critique and you want to take it further. I mean, almost verbatim, you say what you said now, which you said you left out, and I'm sure it's a much more extensive discussion. It's very present here. And I want to encourage you to go a little bit farther than what you were willing to do now, which is a very careful and respectful engagement. But I think your critique of Knoll and others is really quite sharp, and it's about reading organically and reading in an integrated way. You have not left the text as a sick text or a text that can't be read. And I'm mindful that Joel Baden is here, and I'm thinking with Joel, and I know that you're also a student of Joel and a colleague of Joel, but I think that part of what you're doing here is helping us read text, but also, and this goes to the early and the late point, which I know you didn't get a chance to think about, and I don't want to press you on it more now, but I think you're performing, and I said this at one very quick moment towards the end of my comment, I think you're performing the way in which what you're calling the priestly narrative is moving in and out and over time. And there's editing and there are layers and there's engagement. So with respect to that, I think it's a very, very important critique. And my hope is that you continue to engage Pentateuchal materials and you go further. I mean, what you do ultimately with Bloom's critique of the P and H is I guess a separate point altogether. And I guess my other point is that I think, and I've said this to Baruch Schwartz many years ago and others, some of whom are in this audience today, I cannot emphasize enough how important it is to integrate the Dead Sea Scrolls into biblical literature. That doesn't mean that they aren't relevant also for later rabbinic and early Christian discourses, but for the purposes of this panel and for you as a Hebrew Bible scholar, these are part and parcel of the biblical materials, and we cannot understand the Pentateuch, and we cannot understand what we ultimately find in multiple manuscripts, which we now reduce to the Masoretic text, without doing the complex work you're doing, but also attending not only to the versions, but also to what is reduced to rewritten Bible, which is fundamentally also a contribution, I think, to pluriformity in Pentateuch itself. So thank you.
So there are other Liane, I don't know if you want to answer that, or if there are other comments by the panelists before we. So in that case, I'll turn to, if any panelist wants to jump in and say something or have a question, either just signal to me or just unmute yourself and talk. So I wanted to turn to the questions at the Q&A. One thing I wanted to note first, though, is there had been several people had asked about this, when the recording being available. So it will be placed on the Hebrew Judaic website, and all. If you look at the Q&A section, the link was put there, but I'll also put it in the chat section so everyone can access what the link will be, the link at which all of our recorded events are available. And I will say, it's like a lot of the comments are detailed enough that I understand, like I too want to go revisit them and think out some of this. So just that as a note of informative note. So I wanted to start actually with a question about translation that Mark Bernstein notes, and partially before I do, as an opportunity also to plug Professor Feldman's, one of her second book projects, which is a translation of the priestly narrative under the title The Biblical Priestly Narrative, which is under contract with the University of California Press, coming out in their World Literature and Translation series. with a kind of projected publication date of 2023, together with a Hebrew edition of the text. So, but part of the reason I wanted to start with the translation thing is that this is clearly a topic that she's also currently in our department teaching a graduate seminar on issues of translation. So, it's and so anyway, the question asked by Mark Bernstein is to the panelists in general, which we'll open it up to in a moment as well, is part of our problem in our reading of the Priestley, the inability of translation to convey the richness and coherence of the material. And here I mean translation in the literal sense, that is from Hebrew to English, for example, as well as the broader notion of translation between cultures and the disconnect with the non or anti-sacerdotal orientation of modernity.
Should I jump in? And then if somebody else wants to say. So yeah, I mean, so yes, as Annette was saying, I am nearly done at this point with a translation of the Priestley narrative. So this particular question is rather close to my heart and very close to what I've been thinking about for the last year or so since this book left my hands, the last year and a half since this particular book left my hands. So I think as it stands right now, yes, part of our problem of reading the Priestley text is that we have to read it piecemeal. We have to, you have to know what constitutes Priestley and then pick out those certain sections. You have to rely on somebody to tell you what constitutes Priestley, and you have to read it, in sections, jump to this page, jump to that page, etc. It's not a coherent, nowhere is it presented as a coherent whole, right? It's a hypothetical reconstruction of a text based on source critical principles or redaction critical principles. It is one of the few texts that people of different Pentateuchal methodologies can roughly agree on the contours of, so it doesn't totally matter which approach you take. But yeah, some of it is, and one of the reasons I decided to undertake the translation of this project in the first place is that if you were if you weren't reading this in the Hebrew, if you were reading this in like a standard NRSV or JPS translation, that's geared toward the worlds built by the Bible as a whole. And words that have very specific meanings in the Priestley world, part of those things that build the world of P, get often lost or mistranslated in these texts. One of my favorite examples is the use of sin offering for chatat, for example, that sort of conveys a sense of what this sacrifice is for that is actually just wrong. And there's, trust me, and another example actually would be, Martha, going back to your question about kavod, that I translate kavod Adonai everywhere as presence of Yahweh. For a number of reasons, but not glory, but like actual physical presence, which is again in part why I translated that particular verse that you pointed to in the Nadav and Avihu story in that way. And some of this translation practice, some of this sort of history of how the text has been translated and here I owe a debt of gratitude to Anne Knafel's work on anthropomorphism in P. And that for the better part of us, most of the critical history of the study of P, there's been a very anti-anthropomorphic reading of what this text is. And that's just not the truth. Like, that's just not what it's representing. It's very anthropomorphizing of Yahweh in this text. Yahweh sees, he hears, he smells, he eats. It's all of those sort of sensory aspects, all of the physical functions of human beings. So some of the translations that we have access to now obscure that for various reasons, cultural, theological, etc., all the sorts of things that I talk about with my students in my translation seminar. But yeah, so a big part of the reason that I took on this translation project is to say there has to be a better way to communicate what this story is and what the worlds are that it's building, and it was also an experiment. What does this text look like if we translate it as its own text and not as part of a broader canonical corpus? So that'd be my preliminary answer to that, but I'm curious what other panelists think.
Oh, Hindi, please don't jump in.
I think, yeah, okay, I'll be brief. I think Mira also unmuted. So I want to kind of build off of Liane's wonderful answer and say that reciprocally, you did such beautiful work on Moses and character, and it was discussed, but I didn't discuss it. And I just wanted to say that our figures are apotropaic and mantic and divine-like in their priestly character, and I want to say that that's also part of this approaching God and God approaching humanity, and this and something about holiness, as you talked about, as a reciprocal expression. I want to just push a little bit further on this question about altar and translation. I think we really have to make ourselves very small when we try to think about the oracular and the efficacious and the sacrificial in antiquity, because it's not a world that we understand, and we also cannot understand. And this goes back to Liane's work about the universal aspects of P. We cannot understand this universal or the higher and lower registers of reading with respect to what happens already in the priestly narrative, as well as beyond, if we don't allow ourselves to really think about the range, the semantic range, not of individual words, but concepts. And I'm sure that that's also what Martha, I think, already had in mind when we were thinking about, Kavod Adonai. And in that respect, the work has just started. And here, to think about the priestly narrative together with the songs of the Sabbath sacrifice. This is a very important project, right? This is a project of understanding the ways in which figures thought, and translation as a cultural engagement. And in that respect, I'm thinking about this wonderful poem by Rilke, Apollo's Torso, where you reconstruct Apollo and Apollo reconstructs you. And this is what I meant by what was extraordinary about Liane's book. And I respond in a way that I think Alter didn't get in some of the translations. Liane is working very hard, and in that sense, somehow continues or accesses some of this priestly discourse in 2021, which is required in order. We don't have to do what Naftali Meshel did, which is he actually, witnessed and I think participated in sacrifices of animals. I don't know if Liane has gone that far. And I'm not advocating that either. I realize we're being recorded and there are issues around animal rights. So I'm not moving in this direction, but what does it mean to understand a community that transfers guilt, to an animal and sacrifices it? We really have to understand before we dismiss it. And this is part of the work of translation. It's translating our minds and our bodies and our mindsets. And so anyway, that was the second part of the question, I think. Thanks.
I'm happy to add something very briefly. I think that one of the problems with translation is that if we're going to be really faithful to ourselves, we can't even decide that one word means a permanent thing in a single corpus. And you gave the example of chatat, which is one of the things, it's like the bane of my existence, how to translate this word. And the thing is that, in terms of what chatat does, it's purification. There's no doubt about that. It's chite. In terms of the rhetoric constructed about what chatat is good for, it's sin, if we look at like Leviticus 4 and 5. So I think this is one of the things that we're always struggling with, that, yes, chatat would maybe be better translated as purification offering in Leviticus 12, and maybe better translated as sin offering in Leviticus 4. Not because there are different sources, but because there's sort of a rich semantic range to words, even in the limited, context in which they appear. So I think that's just a work that is unlike the priestly work, defined by imperfection and defined by tentativeness. So I really applaud you for your bravery in undertaking it. So thank you. I'm looking forward to the translation.
I humbly submit decontamination offering rather than either of those, with explanation of. But yes, that is the direction I went in the translation.
Okay, so turn to another question from the Q&A from Joel Baden, who's already been mentioned here. To what extent can Professor McGowan's proposal that P may be an attempt to convince Israelites to participate in P's unique priestly economy be combined with the understanding of P as something like utopian?
Yeah, I mean, yeah, when you brought that up, Andrew, that was just an angle I hadn't thought of it from, and I was like, oh, is this coercive? Is this persuasive? Is this it's fascinating. I noticed you unmuted, so I don't know if you wanted to say more. Well, I think I have an answer.
I think you heard me try to qualify the fact that I didn't want to drag us back into the realm of the wicked priests, trying to ensnare people in their horrible ritual schemes, but rather to at least sort of put a hermeneutic of suspicion into the mix along with your very helpful and more positive hermeneutic. I don't know that those two things are completely mutually exclusive, by the way. I mean, if the economy and political system involve mutual obligation, then the sense in which the Israelites are being summoned into a particular form of obligation doesn't necessarily constitute sort of something manipulative. On the other hand, it doesn't necessarily merely constitute an empowerment of them over and against any other group, but rather to sort of express and build a sense of a world in which they have that particular role and relationship. I thought you were probably the better person to keep thinking about that, because I certainly want to credit you with the way in which you turned the camera lens onto the people in that kind of very effective way.
Yeah, it was one of those things that I just, in readings of P and readings of priestly texts, it's so often focused on, this is about the priest, this is for the priest, this is the sort of elevation of the priest. And I was hugely, I mean, I think it came through in the book, but very influenced by Martha's work on in her book, The Kingdom of Priests, and the idea of democratization of priesthood, which you cited a passage where I'm pretty sure you're in the footnote to that passage that you cited in that last chapter there. So yeah, part of it was I wanted to push back against the idea of priestly exclusivity when it comes to the cultic, and the idea that the ritual life of ancient Israel, or of this particular ancient Israel, maybe Judea. I'm not going to even get into the dating thing right now. We'll just say the ritual life of these folks at some point in the first millennium is as much for the people as it is for the priests. And I think, and as much the responsibility of the people as it is for the priests. And part of what I'm thinking aloud in response to this is, it may be that the people need to be convinced of that too. That it's come to such, that's one of the rhetorical aims of this text, maybe to convince the people of their importance alongside the priests, not necessarily to tell them what their place is or to sort of inscribe in legalistic terms their place, but to convince them of the necessity of their participation as well. So yeah, it's something that I need to think a lot more about and think through, but it's an interesting way to take it.
Can I ask you whether you think that the significance given to the minha in Exodus 40 makes sense in those terms as well?
Yeah, although that was a sort of in the weeds question, so I decided to go for the bigger ones. But the mincha is such an interesting offering, in part because it's the one that's accessible to the most number of people, right? It's the offering that's made available to those who can't afford the other offerings. It's the offering that seems to have the widest range of applicability. In most cases, it's offered as though it were an olah. But it can also be offered as a shalomim. It can, where you get portions of it to different people. So I think that could be part of it. I think in this case, I also lean on Naftali Meshel, as Mira was saying. He has quite developed this sort of what the priestly ritual system is and sort of its hierarchies and its combinations. And he's, to my mind, I'm also indebted to his work on this in this book, relatively strongly convinced me that offerings are almost never made on their own, that they usually have accompaniments with them, and that the mincha is it's just sort of, it's part of the conceit of sacrifice as food. You don't eat just meat, you eat meat and bread. You know, as he calls it, it's like the sacrificial happy meal. I think he actually uses happy meal as a as an example, with like the meat, the fries, and the drink, i.e. the sacrifice, the mincha, and the libation offering. So I use the happy meal to teach my students all the time because that works well. But in some ways, I sort of rely on that as sacrificial pairings as part of sort of the meal that invites God into the space.
I also need to take my leave. I'm sorry, I'm expected somewhere else. So thank you again and wish you well.
Oh, thank you very much.
Thank you.
Actually, I was going to ask, I'm going to have a chair's prerogative and ask a question myself before we turn back to the questions that I've written, in part related to some of this logic that the discussion that you just had, which is the case, like when I read your book, I felt that one of the things that really opened up for me was this idea of why it is in the Second Temple period that there's that discussions about priests and sacrifice seem to be a main idiom in which other values are expressed. So this idea, like, oh, on the one hand, it makes sense in terms of being able to recover this kind of very rich world that's being described in ritual details. On the other hand, it also makes sense that those, people living under Persian rule, Hellenistic rule, Roman rule, even, not necessarily priests, might want to like express other ideals through the idiom of priesthood. That's how you describe the heavens or so forth. One of the questions I had, and if you don't have to come up with an answer, if you don't have one, but I would also be curious to hear the other panelists reflect on, is a question like when and when do you think we got to the place that we need this refamiliarized? Like, when did it come to be that this idiom or this kind of way of expressing, or this kind of idea of like taking the ritual and the lists and so forth seriously as meaning making, like where does that break? So on the one hand, when you talk about the priestly source and the importance of, or the priestly narrative and the kind of importance of extricating it, it suggests that redaction of the Pentateuch proper might have been one step in that. And then on the other hand, when Mir, for instance, describes like the way in which this resonates with the kind of the way that, or that Mishnaic language is working too, it suggests like, well, that it's not necessary to extract it to be able to get to the same kind of ideas. So I don't know if you have any reflections on this, but I just wanted to kind of ask if you did have any thoughts.
So I have thoughts about why it happens and why sacrifice and priesthood become such a site of reflection on different ideas and different ideologies. When I don't necessarily have thoughts on when that breaks down. I'd actually be very curious to hear from the panels who are sort of experts in later genres of literature of when that breaks down. Because you're also sort of teeing up here, and I don't know if this is intentional, the other second book that I'm working on, which is looking at these sacrificial texts in the Second Temple period and looking at the very diverse ideologies of sacrifice that they are building and developing and sort of possibly arguing with each other. In some cases, maybe ignoring each other. In others, it's hard to tell. Still very early stages, so I'm not sure. But I think part of why priesthood and sacrifice, I'll sort of answer the why question and then leave the rest of it to at least to the panelists. In my sense, part of the reason why this becomes a site, part of a reason why this has sort of captivated literary and scribal imaginations for several hundred years at least. I mean, depending on where we date P, but we can at least talk about from the 4th to the 1st centuries, this stuff happening, this sort of literature being produced also, is that, to my mind, sacrifice is essentially it's about relationship, it's about community, and it's about how, and you can sort of, it's a cipher for talking about how you define community, how you define relationships, not only between community and God, but within the community itself. And that's some of what I was trying to get across in the book when I was talking about how sacrificial instructions can define spaces and define the ways people relate to spaces and the ways people relate to each other in those spaces. But I think that the ways that we talk about sacrifice also can define identities and relationships between disparate groups of Jews, for example, in later texts. Possibly, I hesitate to even say, because like I haven't finished the research on it yet, so I don't know if it's true or not, but possibly questions of identity between sort of Jews and the communities that they live alongside in diaspora, sort of unclear at that point. But yeah, so the why I think is that it's a particularly fertile place for thinking about relationship and for sort of theorizing and trying to create a systemic kind of understanding of different forms of relationship that, yeah, it just gets taken up in all sorts of interesting ways. But yeah, I'll stop there because I sort of more want to hear what the other panelists have to say since I'm still very early stages on that project.
So thank you. And I'm just building off of what Liane said. I wanted to take the question, Annette, briefly, but in three different ways of answering it. One is that, as Liane made very clear, and I would want to push her a little bit farther and say that the universalizing or the higher reading register to understand the priestly material as part of a participatory gesture on the part of the priests or of Israel with the heavens, right, is part of this, the relationship that Liane is speaking to. And we were talking before about anthropomorphizing God and deifying, if you will, human beings. This dynamic is part of the relationship of Kadoshim Tihiyu that continues all the way through the texts. And it continues, by the way, because you could flip your question, Annette, and you could say, why do people still start by teaching children Leviticus as a starting point long after sacrifice? Or why are people reading in the Beit Midrash sacrificial text long after? I mean, we could ask the other way around, because why does it continue to be relevant? And I think the next point is that it continues to be relevant through a history of interpretation that embraces and understands the universal and the particular as a constant dynamic. So on the one hand, we could talk about philo and allegoresis and higher and lower readings, and I've argued 4Q instruction is already participating in that kind of dynamic. But you can also take a look at the way in which this larger framework for thinking about the world and the universe and God in our world and us and in reciprocally is part of this participation in the sacrificial. So in a way, I think it continues and continues through the history of interpretation. But, and this goes back to the first part of my response to Liane, in the face of, in the face especially of the Protestantization of the reading of the Bible, and Andrew also signaled this, a rejection of the history of interpretation, both through Catholicism or the history of Christianity prior to the Reformation, and in the face of the birth of biblical studies. The priestly text and the law and ritual die, and they die in part because the interpretive life is cut off from it. So it's no longer, when Kugel called the Bible as it was, and Phyllis Tribble said, but it never was like that. Sola Scriptura is the Bible as it was. And his point was, no, actually, that was the Bible in all of its interpretive complexity. And if we forget that register, it's relating is an even higher level that you were talking about earlier, Liane. But even before that, we don't remember how to read it. So then it seems like it doesn't belong with the other sources. It's not an integrated part. So we can't imagine P and non-P even being in conversation with each other if there's no longer this universal dimension. This, by the way, is all over a lot of texts like Wisdom of Solomon and like Philo of Alexandria, and arguably the earliest discussions of the Pascha, of the Passover sacrifice, which is very real. It's not just a metaphor, and it's not just, it's real and it's present. So ritual as a way of preserving, and it's really, Liane, your book has helped me clarify this position about what we want to call, hermeneutics, is very much about historical context and cultural studies. I think this is also a contribution to culture. So I'm not sure if I answered, Annette, your question, but I'm trying to say that part of what's lost is not irrecoverable. we can recover it, but then we also have to engage critically the history of biblical scholarship. And honestly, and I say this in part because Mira and Martha are here, right? It's also about Wissenschaft des Judentums, right? It's the question of the cadaver. Is this a life and life-giving force of Jewish text and Judaism, or is it a cadaver that we're studying, we're dissecting and cutting up into bits? Thanks.
I just wanted to add just kind of one quick thing is that, you know, so Joel Baden in the Q&A comments asked in part, is the breakdown and understanding how sacrifice works and how its text should be read not fundamentally connected to Christianity's rejection of Jewish ritual while still trying to preserve the ritual text as part of their sacred corpus. You know, I think that is actually an open question. It's too bad that Andrew had to leave, because I think as, you know, as someone, a scholar of early Christianity, he has also, you know, he's among he's a person who I think, you know, I at least personally think has most persuasively and in most detail also showed how that taking ritual seriously has a nachleben within early Christianity as well. So I think that story is more complex, but I do think it's interesting because I was like, you know, when you think, you know, the temptation is to say, oh, it's like a rejection of priestly authority. And that's one thing that happened. But as like Mira's book on the Blood for Thought shows, that's, you know, you can have priestly authority taken away from the idea of taking sacrifice seriously as an idiom to talk about the world. So I just want to kind of note that the continuation of the conversation, the Q&A, which actually is a very rich conversation, but I will just kind of wanted to make sure to go back to some of the questions that had been asked initially. Mark McIntyre says, is P's entire wilderness narrative an act of fantasy or imagination, a portable Jerusalem moving through the wilderness connecting Mount Sinai and Mount Zion, with Moses reigning over it for 40 years like David and Solomon? Is it so directly contradictory to Jay's wilderness narrative, in which the wilderness is trying to kill them and they have to get through as fast as possible? So essentially about how you see P in this regard, the priestly narrative in this regard in relation to Jay.
Yeah, sure. So that's an interesting question. So I think I first take a step back and say that I think that the entirety of the priestly narrative is a fantasy. And I sort of put that to say I think I call it this at the end of the book, that I fundamentally see it as a myth designed to describe the foundation of sacrifice. So in some ways, I'm not looking at this, you know, I've had teachers who call it a priestly history. I'm not sure I see it as a history. I see it as a kind of imaginative foundation myth in some ways, trying to explain the shape of the community, the function of sacrifice, the reason that it exists, how it fits with the identity of Israelites, etc. But to go to this question more specifically, I actually really like this question because I have sort of an article hashed out that I'm working on P in the wilderness right now, in part because that came through actually my translation project, because it's a thing that I hadn't noticed until I sat down to translate the sections of P in the wilderness, that the Israelites in P are also convinced that the wilderness is going to kill them. That is actually not something that is unique to J. And in fact, there's this whole sequence. It's about 4, maybe 5. At this point, I haven't looked at my notes in a little bit. It's either 4 or 5 scenes where the Israelites sort of will register a complaint, that complaint will get addressed, then they'll register another complaint, and it actually escalates to the point where the complaint becomes against Moses himself and saying, you know what, if God is fixing all of these complaints, why do we even need you? You know, what are you doing for us? And it sort of becomes this moment of an attempted coup to sort of dethrone Moses as the one reigning over the wilderness. Now, obviously this fails. There's like a response to that in which Moses and Aaron are sort of reinscribed as the authorities and sort of confirmed by Yahweh as such. But it's an interesting sort of sequence of events in the wilderness in P, and that the Israelites come out sort of swinging right away, almost as soon as they leave Sinai, saying, we should have just died in Egypt. This is horrible. We're going, now we have 40 years here. We're going to die. This, what are you doing to us? That does end up with a couple attempts to sort of reorganize the leadership of the community. Ultimately, yes, Moses does reign over it for the 40 years. But I think it's a little bit more complicated than sort of Moses just reigning over the wilderness in P, whereas the wilderness is trying to kill the people in the non-priestly materials. So yeah, I would just say it's a little more complicated than that, but I think part of what you're seeing there is, yes, Moses prevails in a way in the priestly story that he does not in others.
We're starting to run out of time, so I'm actually going to ask a question that I'm going to just take 3 of the questions that are a bit related and ask them from the Q&A. One of them is from Kevin Madison, which notes that, to the degree that P builds a distinctive world, could you say more about who and what P's world building is for? And this is also kind of related. Well, Matthias de Carvalho, and I apologize if I mispronounce your name, also actually asked, also in relation to whether you can see a response to Ezekiel in particular. Gregory Bloomquist kind of also asked a similar question with regard to literacy. So this case, does this presume literacy? So got kind of 3 questions about audience that you can choose to kind of answer as you like. But
as Hindi so beautifully put in her response, this is not a book about history. That's my attempt at a dodge. I will not dodge. So what I will say is that when I was writing this particular book, that is actually a question that I found distracting to reading P as a story, trying to understand its world. In part because I think we can understand what it's saying without necessarily defining which century which part was written in. Now that being said, I am aware that my teachers are here and they're going to not be happy with what I'm about to say. So sorry guys, but my sense, the more I have been looking at this text, the more I have been engaging with this text, and as I'm working with texts from the 4th to the 2nd centuries, is that the audience that I think, at least in the final form that we have of P, all of the things that can be seen as priestly in the Pentateuch, here sort of lumping in holiness code stuff, post-holiness code stuff, etc., that this is a text that has a 3, maybe 4 century long life that was probably being edited itself into the Hellenistic period. I actually thoroughly believe that at this point. And so is this presuming literacy? Is this maybe in parts responding to Ezekiel? Yeah, sure. I think it goes both ways though, when we're talking about Ezekiel. I think there's points at which we can talk about Ezekiel responding to maybe some of the earlier traditions in P. And then we can talk about traditions in P that may be responding to developments in Ezekiel, and quite likely developments in other priestly texts some that we have, some that we may not. But we can see sort of different priestly discourses unfolding within Pentateuchal priestly materials. And so I think it's not one direction, that they're sort of back and forth between these different priestly texts over the course of several centuries. And does that require literacy? Yeah, it does. These, as much as I say this is a text that's advocating for the inclusion of ordinary Israelites, it's still being composed and circulated in scribal circles that often, are not accessible to those ordinary Israelites. And this is just one of those fundamental issues of biblical literature that we have to deal with. So.
Okay, so with that, we'll wrap up the discussion. So first of all, I wanted to, apologies to those whose questions we were unable to get to. The Q&A was actually very lively, which I think speaks well to both the project and the panelists. I want to give a warm thanks to all of our panelists here. for this wonderful discussion. And also thanks and congratulations again to Professor Feldman for giving us this opportunity to talk about sacrifice in such detail. So thank you to everybody. I also, as we noted that this event, since this event was recorded, it will be made available online. If I understand Kirsten correctly, the link will be sent out to people who are registered. So a number of people had asked about being able to access it afterwards. And it's I think, which also speaks well to the kind of richness and detail of our conversation here today. So just thank you very much to everybody.